Hey. Well, thank you, everybody. Look at this, right on time, pulling in. So today, what I wanted to do was kind of go over, it's been such a crazy year and a half, 2 years, right? And someone might argue a rougher 4 or 5 years. So what I wanted to do was highlight this training that we do. It's called Dimensions of Diversity. And this course is usually like a 6-hour kind of thing. And it just helps to share perspective and bring awareness about how we show up and how we interact with others. Like, what our own experiences that kind of impact the way that we interact and communicate and perceive conversation and actions and everything. So even though it's 6 hours, we're going to do this is the first time I'm doing it in 30 minutes. Because I'm used to doing it in an hour for our high school students and our college students. Again, the whole idea is that it is self-reflective and it's all about perspective. So we'll kind of go through this and keep that in mind. There might be things that talks about we're going to do something in chat, or we're going to do something in a small breakout room. But for the purposes of today, because it's just half an hour, it really is self-reflective. So we're not going to go over anything in the chat or anything like that. Keahi is going to be my slide guy. So he's just going to kind of hit the next every time I say. But this is a capture of what we will sort of be talking about today, is kind of how the country has been changing, keeping in mind that this data that we're going to show, I think, is from 2014. So it's pretty outdated at this point already, but it does show the trend of change in population. And then we'll kind of define what diversity is. For many of us, I think we know, but it's always helpful to review together. And then we'll introduce the diversity wheel, which the YMCA borrowed from an author. And it really helps to, again, capture the different components of who we are. And the thing is, right, no matter where you are in life, this might change. And so it doesn't matter if you are super self-aware already, or you feel like you're established in life. Things kind of change throughout time just because of experiences and situations. So it's always great to just kind of self-reflect. We'll really briefly touch base on bias and communication, and then again, really briefly touch on inclusion. But most of our time today is going to be spent on diversity. Okay, Keahi? We can skip this one, Keahi. Okay, so again, self-reflective, but think to yourself. You don't have to share this in the chat. But what is one thing about yourself that people may not necessarily pick up just by looking at you? And think about the last year that we've had, right? All this Zoom, right? Like sometimes it's like, oh, people might not even know you're not wearing pants that day, right? But try to go a little deeper than that. But what is something that they may not know about you, right? For me, many of you guys know, I can't swim, right? I'm taking lessons, and Kilo almost got me there. Can tread water for 2 minutes now, y'all. But you may not know that just by looking at me, right? And knowing that I'm from Hawaii. So again, self-reflective. But what is one thing that you may not, people may not be able to tell about you just by looking at you? Okay. And if you do, I can't see the chat anyway, but if you just think that it's fun or you do want to share, I'm not going to call out on it, but you could put it in the chat just to see what others are kind of saying. Okay, but we'll keep moving on. Keahi, next slide. So this is more because normally we have discussion. This is something that we go over together, but this is helpful for you, right? So being open and honest with yourself. Again, because we're not sharing, I mean, can't really keep secrets from yourself. So really be open and honest about the way that you respond and reflect on some of these things. Be willing to kind of challenge yourself and be respectful of yourself. Oftentimes we always only think about being respectful of others, but really be respectful of what your limits and boundaries are and knowledge is. And then again, the last two is kind of just a reminder that we're all learning. It doesn't matter what stage we are in life. We are all in this kind of journey together. Okay, Keahi. So, 2017, yeah. So the next slides, so I was a few years off, but the next slides are gonna be all the different changes that YUSA put together at the time, and kind of some of these are current, and then some were like, oh, by 2050 or whatever. So we'll give each slide a couple minutes, just so that you can read it on your own. And there's about 4 or 5 of them. So just think, which ones kind of stand out to you. But Keahi, give it like a couple minutes and then can flip through each one. And again, sorry, this is nationally, right? So not locally. The goal is to have some of our interns make this logo for us. Oh, look, the chat does pop up on my screen. So thank you, Donna, for sharing that. Sorry, I'm on my phone, so it's a different kind of view that I'm not used to. But yeah, thank you, Donna. Yep, totally right. The change in the percentages of and just how it's kind of, dare I say, like equaling out, sorta, or trend of. I think this is the last one. So okay. Thanks, Carrie. So again, if I saw a couple people put it in the chat already, but again, really think to yourself, like, what's surprising, right? There's so many different generations, and on this call, and this is only what, like 30 something of us, right? But so many different generations that are here. So think about, these are the changing demographics in the country, but what was it like for you as an individual kind of growing up? What kind of experiences did you have? What was it like, right? And how this might be changing, and what's the reality of that difference and that change. So just really kind of paying attention to that, and a lot of this might be a whole lot different now after COVID, right? That food insecurity, the purchasing power even, right? Maybe that was the trend where the purchasing power was greater, but maybe it's not after the pandemic, right? Because people just kind of shifted. So just thinking about the constant change in dynamics in our country. When we do this with teens and college students, we really do emphasize the purchasing or buying power, right? Because oftentimes students and teens and even kupuna, right, like or seniors, they don't necessarily fully understand the scope of the decisions and impact they can make by where they put their money, right? Excuse me. It's not always just about where you're donating, it's what products you're buying, right? And that goes a whole way. And so even when you look at the change in presidencies and even COVID, right? What people stood behind and backed was a direct reflection to reach out to their buying base, right? Or their consumers, right? So it does say a lot. So just kind of thinking about that and how we kind of communicate with teens that they do have a say, right? Okay. So you can think a little bit about your own community, right? And that can be identified however you want, right? So maybe it is Wiseman, right? Maybe it's your neighborhood, maybe it's your workplace, but just kind of take a few seconds to think about what are some of the things that you've seen kind of changing. And you can decide to think about it before COVID, because COVID just changed everything anyway. But what were some trends that you were seeing kind of in the workplace or in that specific community kind of have in mind? Give you a few seconds. And again, you can choose to share or not, but we won't necessarily kind of spend time on it. Okay. All right. So I won't cover this whole thing, but for the why, again, this is a YMCA training, right? So for the why, everything is about the mission and that last couple words for all, right? So when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and equity, right, it really is to emphasize that component of for all. So this idea of holistic approach to our focus areas and spirit, mind, and body, right? And that if we do tap into everybody's diverse abilities and diverse experiences, then only then can we really have a super strong kind of environment and super strong community and culture, right? But we really need to tap into everyone's diverse backgrounds as a strength versus a challenge or a weakness. And that's kind of the wise belief. Okay, Keahi? So here's some things that we like to emphasize to folks. It's kind of funny doing this with students because they don't always understand what some of these things are. But diversity is not affirmative action, right? It's not tokenism. So this is the one that I emphasize a lot, right? It's not, oh, we need the Asian at the table, or, oh, we need the youth person at the table, right? It's not just having those different diverse backgrounds at the table just so that you can check a box and say you got it, right? That's tokenism, right? It's not just about cultural stereotypes, or gender or race. And the thing about diversity is that it can't just be a program, right? We can't say, oh, we did this workshop, so we're diverse, right? We can't say, oh, we're doing a diversity program, right? It's more about how you are interacting and ingraining that in your everyday kind of actions, behaviors, and choices, right? It's just kind of like a way of life, really, right? Not a specific thing to again check a box. Okay, Keahi. And I'll just leave this here. I think we kind of talked about it, but I do like this, the way that it's phrased. Okay, thanks, Carrie. So this is the diversity wheel. Again, this is not YMCA created. This is borrowed from Marilyn Loden. And we're gonna dive into each one specifically. It may not be super clear for you right now, but as you can see, right, it starts with you as an individual in the middle, and then every kind of layer or layer to the onion in this really starts to break up a little bit more about who you are and what makes you you, right? The thing to keep in mind as we kind of dive into each of these layers, or I should say dimensions, right? But the thing to kind of keep in mind in this is that how they interact with one another, right? And how that then impacts you, right? So it's not just about these individual things, for some of us, we might be the same age, but that's just one factor, right? All because we're the same age doesn't mean we're going to perceive things and perceive the world and experience the world the same way. Sorry, let me move rooms, start eating lunch. So that's kind of the whole thing to keep in mind is as we dive through each one. Okay. Okay, so Keahi can switch. Oh, and I just found where Keahi was this whole time. We're on the other side of the wall from each other. So again, so starting in the middle, right? You as a person, right? And this is important to keep in mind when we talk about self-care, when we, you know, whatever the conversation is, this is always important to remember that you, you're that center of everything. Okay, okay. And then the idea of self-identification, right? This is kind of, I don't want to say new, but there's more awareness to this, right? That we as individuals can choose how we want to show up, right? It's not as clear cut anymore as saying, you know, I think a good one is with gender, right? For a lot of folks on this call, the idea of pronouns and, you know, identifying as a different gender may be relatively new, right? That's something that's been popping up more in the last 5 to 10 years around diversity and equity and inclusion, right? But self-identification goes beyond just gender. It kind of touches on any of these things. So that's why that's kind of around the individual. It's because how you choose to identify and show up. Okay, okay. And then these other layers and these are kind of what kind of pulls it all together. But that exterior is that collective and global context, right? So I kind of mentioned the idea that on this cause, there's different generations, right? How I show up as a 35-year-old and how I experience the world is very different from how my grandma shows up and experiences the world, right? And it's just because there was different collective global context going on, right? So for my grandma, something that frustrates me is that she hoards stuff, right? She doesn't want to throw anything away. It's keep, right? Because one day you might need it, right? So for me, that's annoying as heck, right? Because we have so much stuff. Excuse me. But kind of taking a look at it, right? She grew up through the war, right? And at the time, you had to keep everything because you didn't know if and when you would be able to get things back, or you know if you would lose it or what. And so it was this idea of really holding onto your resources. And so that's why that's really such a different global context, right? Everything else could be the same on how we are raised and how we experience the world, but with that global context being different, it changes everything. Okay, so okay. So these are and sorry, excuse, I don't know what's going on with my throat, but these are the core dimensions, right? So as you can kind of see, it's grayed out in the middle, but it goes individual, the self-identification, and these are the core dimensions. The reason why they're called core is that these are things that you, generally speaking, can't change, right? They're pretty like when you're born, you're kind of born into it. And these are things that are core to who you are, right? You can't change your birthplace, right? You can't necessarily change your race. You might identify differently, but you can't change these core components about yourself. I think some of us, right, might want to change our age, can't really change our age though, right? So these are things that are core to you. Okay. So just kind of breeze through these. And again, think about, I think I might be leading into the next slide, but that's okay, is think about how you identify in these core dimensions, okay? And think of them individually first. So, okay, what gender are you? What's your sexual orientation? What's your national origin? Think of them as individuals, okay, or individually. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Oh, I don't know where Keahi is going. Thanks. Keahi is telling me to hurry up, I guess. So so now that you've kind of had some time to think about them as individuals, now choose any two of them, right? And then put those two things together and kind of ask yourself, how do those things together interact? And how does that change the way that you might experience the world, right? Or maybe not change, but how does that impact, I should say, the way that you experience the world, right? So take a few seconds to kind of do your own little combos along the way. If you're so inclined to like try to get all of them together, how does that impact the way that you identify and how you experience the world? Okay. And normally we would spend a little bit more time, but for the sake of time, here's what I'm going to ask you as well. Now that you've ideally identified yourself in each of these areas, and now that you've started to think about how they interact with one another, and keep in mind again, this is just the core dimensions. I challenge you to think of someone you get along with and someone you may not get along with. And then think about how you experience and how these areas, this core dimension impacts the way that you show up and experience the world. Think about, is there an opportunity there, or is there a correlation between why you may get along with that person or may not get along with that person, right? Maybe not, but we're gonna kind of go through this a little bit more as well, right? Think about how you communicate. How do these things change the way you communicate? And it's even not just by language, right? But email versus text versus phone call, right? Versus Zoom, right? So the fluidity of all of that, okay? So that's just the core dimension. And again, so much to unpack there, right? To kind of really think about for yourself, and then how you show up and how others might perceive you too, right? So, and how that changes the way that you engage, interact, and show up with others. Okay, so we're going to move on from the core dimensions. Again, this is just the core, so kind of crazy. So we can go on to the, I think, next slide, to the secondary. Oh, so here, I would just, this is good to point out. So this is kind of a YMCA insert that race is socially constructed, right, over time, right? So it's interesting because when you look historically, right, this wasn't necessarily a thing, right? But because we started to have to kind of bucket people into different, descriptive, I guess, words, over time, it became this idea of what race is, right? So just keeping that in mind, and ethnicity, right? Because these are often kind of used interchangeably. Ethnicity is a little bit different. Okay. But for those of you who are like super politically active and things like that, right? The fact that when you look at how the government asks you what you are, right? It's really this idea to bucket, put people in these different buckets for different reasons, right? So when you think of yourself as an 18-year-old or 15-year-old, right? And how that shows up over time, constantly being asked, what's your race? What's your race? What's your race? When you might be, you never want to be that other category, so it's all these little things to really think about how we ask for information and ask how people identify and how they show up and what makes them them and unique. But this is just kind of a good slide to cover that. This could be a whole nother conversation. So, all right, next. So here's the secondary dimensions. And the important thing to point out about secondary dimensions is that it's not secondary because they don't matter as much. They're secondary because you have a little bit more flexibility with this, right? They become a little bit more fluid. They're the situations and experiences that you're going through, right? And things that you may not have as much control over. Or you might have a little bit more control of. So it's kind of where that core dimensions are just, it's really hard to change. These may change over time, right? So sorry. Emails and texts are still coming through, so have to kind of slide that. So think about this now, same process, right? Don't even try to link the core dimensions to this yet, but just start to identify for yourself how you feel that you show up or how you are present in these different areas. Okay. And again, now try to do the same thing, right? How does the way that you identify in these different areas start to mix with each other and impact the way that you experience and perceive the world, and um, experience and perceive the world, and then how you might communicate with others or interact with others, right? A simple one for myself. Um, my parents are together, right? So I've lived the whole life of a dual parent, household, right? So no, all things else the same, I would still experience the world differently from a peer or a friend that is from a single parent household, and very much different from a peer or colleague that grew up in a foster home, right? Or was raised by their grandparents, right? So just in that one thing, so different, right? Okay. So I'm going to go one step further and challenge you. If you remember some of the things from the core dimensions, I know it's kind of grayed out here, but now start to piece it together, right? Get ready for your mind to be blown. But how did things like age, your marital status, your parental status, right? You know, the way you grew up in the household, but also how, yeah, if you are a parent yourself, right? So a couple of different things there with your gender, with your sexual orientation, with your national, your origin, national origin, and how you were, what geographic location you're from, right? I'm just kind of pulling all these, right? Again, all things the same. Um, Me living in Kailua and then, but kind of being raised in Makali is very different from someone who is from another island, right? Or heck, in Makiki, right? Like right down the road, shows up very different in how this impacts us. Okay. So again, very self-reflective. And then we can go to the next one, I think. Might be one more. Yeah, one more. Okay, and here are the organizational dimensions, right? So something that I would assume majority of us on this call have in common is one of the organization things is that we are all a part of Wiseman in some way, shape, or form, right? But even within that, there's different, right? Whether you're an officer, whether you're a new club member. So that's where some things like seniority come into play, right? And that's only specific to Wiseman, right? Think about if you are, an employee within a company, right, or organization, right? If you're in other organizations of service or whatever, if you're on boards, right? All of these different things start to now impact the way that we experience and show up, right? So again, I'll give you some time to kind of think about this and kind of identify how you identify. Right? So a lot to unpack there, right, for yourself. And again, if you were to create all of this together, right? Or put all of this together in all these different areas, it really kind of helps you to understand yourself a little bit more. And then the idea is that understanding yourself a little bit more and being a little bit more self-aware helps you to understand others and how you engage with them, right? For me, the first time the reason why I shared that example about my grandma and how she holds on to everything is going through this the very first time years ago helped me realize that, right? I was like, oh, that's why she holds on to all that stuff, right? I was going to say junk, but it's not junk. It's important to her. It's junk to me, right? Because that's not stuff that I accrued. So it's very interesting to think about how you engage with your loved ones, your colleagues, and people that you may not click with, right? It's just having that awareness to understand that perspective. Okay, Keahi. And then one more. So if you've noticed, there's been blank spaces throughout all of them on the bottom. That was a test. No. If you didn't know, then you weren't paying attention. But the reason why these are all blank is because the YMCA added this, I believe. And it was because we don't want to, again, that conversation about race, right? And always kind of telling people, here's the boxes that you have to check. We want to be kind of acknowledge the fact that there may be things missing from this wheel. And that might be important to you, right? So this is that box that you might say, oh yeah, but there's a core dimension that I feel like is important to me that wasn't covered, right? So these are left blank just for the idea and to kind of show that there's a lot more that's involved in assessing who you are and understanding who you are. So this is that space that you might fill that in. Okay. Yeah. And I think, to be honest, I think we're up on time. So I want to say, we'll kind of go through, I can't remember all of these, but Keahi, maybe let's see. Yeah, okay. So we'll just end it on this slide, right? And think about just how I've been saying, think about how you might engage with some of these folks, right? For me, I mentioned my grandparent, but also my parents. I never really saw them as a person, right? Like in reality, never really saw them as a person with all these different dimensions themselves. I've only seen them as a parent, right? And that relationship there. I've never stopped to think and ask, and really understand how they might show up in these different areas and how that impacts the way that not just how they parent me, but how my relationship is with them, right? And how I communicate with them. So think about these. We have a couple of minutes before I'm supposed to be done. So again, really kind of take your time to think about these. And if there's a different relationship that you want to kind of, I guess, focus on more, then think about that as well.
I think we're okay with time, Cassidy, so we can open it up to Q&A.
And keeping in mind, I might not have an answer for you, right? I'm just presenting. I am not a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. So again, my role is to just facilitate some self-reflection.
That was pretty good, Cassidy, getting out of that one.
Well, does anybody want to share something or saying about parents or grandparents? How's Cassidy's talk influenced you? How about that?
Yeah, and I will say it's okay if not, but oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I realized when I was watching or when I was looking at the graphs, my parents came out of the World War II era, and I was born just shortly after that. And in our household, they made it a point for me to speak English. They wanted me to be English speaking and not speak any Japanese. And that was because my father and my mother wanted to show loyalty to America. And Dad fought in the 100th Battalion and so on. And so it became very important for me to read, write, and speak English properly. So they pushed me in that direction as far as my education, even my college education. Getting a degree in secondary education at the University of Hawaii, it was speech communications. So,
Yeah,
but
and, you know,
yeah,
oh, sorry. So I was just going to say, and that's such a, I'm so glad you shared that specifically because, right, when you look at today, how many people do we need to translate, right? And there's so many people, myself included, who don't speak, you know,
that's
a
right.
second language, right? And it's such a skill. It's looked at as a skill now, right? But even when you dive into the education system, right, everything is English language learner, English language learner, English language learner, right? And, you know, it's finding that balance because they, you know, you do need to learn English at this point in the world, right? But finding that balance of making sure that students and everyone is aware that, you know, that doesn't mean that you should forget your native language, right? Or learn your native language, right? And that's that whole point of that changing demographic, right? And the change in times, right? Back then it was about, unfortunately, right? Like conquering the world, right? And putting the US on, you know, being here and there. And so we're seeing a rise in individuals saying, this is not okay, right? The idea of colonialism. We need to find this balance. And that's why there's so much happening around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that people are highlighting their own cultures. You know, and it's not just for us locally, right? It is a lot of Hawaiiana, right? For its own reasons, right? But to your point, right, it's also the Asian communities, right? So it's just crazy to think about, but again, take all those different components and how kids might show up on this diversity wheel now. So, and so what we can do, and I would challenge it before I kind of say I'm done, I would challenge even for Wiseman, right, to think about the diversity wheel. And we've always talked about recruitment, right? How do we get new people and how do we engage younger members and all these different components? So I think this is an opportunity for self-reflection, and not just as individuals, but potentially down the road, even as a club and a region, you know, on how we as a collective and organization show up as well. But with that, I'll be quiet. So thank you for letting me share.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Cassidy and Keahi. Very informative. Big hand to Cassidy and